بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In the name of Allah, the entirely merciful, the especially merciful.
يؤتي الحكمة من يشاء ومن يؤت الحكمة فقد أوتي خيرا كثيرا وما يذكر إلا أولو الألباب.
He gives wisdom to whom He wills, and whoever has been given wisdom has certainly been given much good, and none will remember except those of understanding.
صدق الله العظيم.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. CAS was established in 2019 to fill in the knowledge and research gaps that existed in the domains of aerospace and national security in an otherwise think tank rich capital Islamabad. To achieve our objective of being amongst the best think tanks of the region and with focused mission, CAS has made significant contributions by providing policy guidelines on important issues of national interest, especially security, both in military and non-military domains, disseminated through direct as well as indirect engagement on regular basis. As part of the advisory board of the Government of Pakistan's National Security Division, CAS has and would continue to serve as a thought leader by providing independent, innovative, evidence-based solutions to strengthen Pakistan's national security, including specific emerging geostrategic and geo-economic situations. Maintaining a winning aerospace power requires high-end technologies that are not only cost-intensive, but their availability with the passage of time is likely to be challenging. In our region, these technologies are largely acquired. Therefore, working towards our vision of strengthening national security in all its domains through indigenization, CAS would continue to lay emphasis on innovative research on emerging technologies, including but not limited to cyber and space. We continue to enhance our reach through greater use of media, seminars, webinars, digital technologies, joint research, and cementing our relationship with domestic, regional, and global partners. Inshallah, in times ahead, we will continue to build upon our achievements.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're gathered here today for the book launch ceremony of Pandemics and Public Value Management. The book debates the coronavirus pandemic was a scourge that left hardship, sorrow, and misery for many of us and imposed an immense strain on societies. The global coronavirus pandemic pushed civil society, public managers, politicians, and society at large into uncharted waters. Based on public value theory, this book is a timely key as to how to proceed forward in the future. It presents this forward-looking perspective through an interesting amalgamation of lessons drawn from the pandemic, such as the life versus livelihood debate, infodemic and misinformation, challenges faced by international bodies, and vaccine nationalism during production and dissemination. At the end, the book presents a fascinating case study that makes an illustrative comparison of how Pakistan and India managed the pandemic. The book concludes, it was an unforgettable phase in our lives, and the future pandemics can be managed in a better manner. So without further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker of the ceremony, Professor Karl Moore. Professor Karl Moore is a professor of strategy and organization at McGill University, Canada. Professor Moore joined McGill's Faculty of Management in autumn 2000, where he teaches graduate courses in strategy and leadership. He has taught extensively in executive education and MBA programs with leading universities, including Oxford, Stanford, Harvard, Cambridge, and Duke, to mention a few. Professor Moore's publications include 28 journal articles, 10 books and edited volumes, 14 chapters in books, 31 executive articles, and dozens of conference papers. I would now like to request Professor Moore to deliver his remarks.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be at CAS. I've visited virtually a number of times and hoping to come this fall in person and meet some of the wonderful people there. Well, one of my favorite students I've ever had is Dr. Usman, as you know him. I've put together a list with one of my students. I've taught over 5,000 students at McGill since being here and about 1,000 at Oxford, and he stands out as one of the brightest, one of the most valuable. And I think this book just reconfirms what a fine mind you were blessed to have in your presence over there, and very much a credit to Pakistan, as is his brother who works here in Montreal, and his parents who were wonderful ambassadors, literally ambassadors, but were great ambassadors and the best in the full sense of the word for Pakistan. A family of enormous credit to your country. It's as a fascinating book to read through on public value theory that was very well written, accessible to people who are experts as well as non-experts in the field. And one of the central points he makes at great length and very, very helpfully and appropriately is how that our view of what public value is evolved enormously during the case of the pandemic. And he focuses on the case of Pakistan and India particularly, but looks around the world. And it's interesting because I teach at a business school here at McGill and at Oxford as well. And the view of the role of business has evolved enormously in the last 10 years. And I think during the pandemic, it continued to evolve. And this is, I think, an interesting parallel and track to public value theory is that what is the purpose, the meaning of a corporation? Now, it's a big debate in the UK, the US, Canada, and Australia, and elsewhere. What's the point of a corporation? What is the value they bring? The traditional view, Milton Friedman's view, which still has some adherence, is that it's to produce shareholder value. I was down in Toronto with the National Bank, one of the biggest banks in Canada, and what we did was an analyst day on Bay Street, which is the Canadian equivalent of Wall Street. So I took some of the top CEOs and CFOs of the big companies in Montreal down to Toronto, down to Bay Street, to see hundreds of analysts. And it's something where the share price is a critical thing indeed. And executive compensation is based on that. But today we're taking a much broader view of the purpose of a corporation. It is no longer just to do shareholder value, but it's stakeholder value. And so that's why I found this book particularly interesting, was the parallels between the business world and the world of public value, which would include, broadly speaking, corporations to some degree. The world is evolving and going to a different place because of the pandemic. And this was a trend that was already occurring but if you would, was put on steroids by the pandemic to say, how are you getting literally food to consumers? So I interviewed the CEO of Loblaws, one of the big food companies here, one of the big retailers. They have about 200,000 employees. And they were seen as essential workers during the pandemic because literally you needed to go there to get food. And they did not shut down for more than a day in the course of the pandemic. The essential workers, part of it, very much important. And it really highlighted people that we may not see as the most important in society, but simply people that are stocking our shelves in the supermarket to provide food for the rest of us to survive and get by on. UPS drivers, people like that, which we had not seen as important, but are central now to our society. I have a CEO class and a CEO radio show where I interview a CEO a week for an hour one-on-one across Canada. And I've interviewed about 100 plus CEOs since the pandemic. The early conversation is, when did you shut your organization down? Was one of the first questions. Then it evolved to, do you have a war room, a war cabinet? And almost all of them did in the early days, March and April, May and June of the pandemic. And it's evolved to a point where they're thinking about it differently. Just finished a book on Generation Z, and as a professor, I spend a lot of time for someone my age with 20-year-olds. I have 8 of them working for me. So I'm older than most of you, and my workforce is younger unless you run a McDonald's. So it's something where I have a very young workforce, Generation Z, and they're looking for purpose at work. One of the famous bumper stickers, the U.S., we don't have bumper stickers in Canada, but they do in the U.S., and is a famous one is, he who dies with the most toys wins, is a boomer view of the world. My students shake their head at the shallowness of the boomers. It doesn't matter how beautiful your suit is, what kind of car you drive. What it matters is your life has purpose and meaning. So the challenge to companies in North America and Europe is, how do you provide purpose to Zs? Otherwise, they're not going to work for you. Now, we probably have a recession coming, it appears, from North American viewpoint. But there's a war for talent for young people. My CEO class last year and the year before, this has never happened before, CEOs would say, Karl, can you send me some of your students? And they never asked this before, but there is an absolute war for talent. Our son, I think, just finishing a master's in data analytics at McGill. You can have 0 personality and still get a job in data analytics. Like, it really doesn't matter. They're desperate. And CEOs will ask, when I mentioned my son's name, and said, oh, can you send them to work for me? Because there's such a war for talent in specific areas. But generally, young people are under huge demand, which means we've got to listen to them with greater clarity in the past. One of the key points, one of the key chapters in my book, based on hundreds of interviews of C-suite executives and hundreds of interviews of Zs, is that they're looking for purpose and meaning. So the value of what a corporation does, shareholder value, and as someone who will retire someday, and I've got stocks in my portfolio, I don't manage it, I'm not a finance prof, I have experts that manage that. But when you look at it, we're evolving to a place where purpose matters. That the value of a corporation is measured by Zs and increasingly by the stock market is, what are you doing for the world? How are you making it a better place? Who are you helping out there? How are you promoting women? How are you promoting racial minorities? Which in Canada, about 5% of our population is Indigenous, about 4% is Black, and about 18% are Asian. Which is it's embarrassing that we say Asians and lump India, Pakistan, China, Taiwan, Korea, Japan all together as one. Because you know the world is so different just in Pakistan, let alone compared to you in China. But we have minorities here, and making place for them in a society, if you're going to live in an immigrant society like Canada, we have to. So I love the book. The evolution of public values, when we see paralleled in terms of corporate value and how we value corporations, how we think about them, and how we think that they bring value to the world. So hats off, Doctor. Very much enjoyed it. You continue to write with great clarity and great insight. It was a pleasure to read. I'll turn the floor back now to our moderator.
Thank you, Professor Moore, for your insightful deliberations. I would now like to welcome Professor Enrico Bracci. Professor Enrico Bracci is a professor of accounting at the University of Ferrara, Italy. He serves as a Vice Director of the Department of Economics and Management and Vice Director of Public Value Research Center. He is editorial board member of several journals, such as Accounting, Auditing, and Accountability Journal, Journal of Accounting, Accountability in Emerging Economies, and Journal of Public Budgeting, Accounting, and Financial Management. He is also an executive committee member of the Public Service Accounting and Accountability Group. Professor Bracci is co-editor of book series on public service, accounting, and accountability. I would now request Professor Bracci to come on Zoom to share his insights.
Thank you. And thank you to Usman for the invitation. And also thank to Karl Moore for his previous speech that he addressed from a corporate point of view. My speech instead in debating and discussing about the topics of the book, which I certainly enjoyed. And in truth, this is the third book that I read by Usman. And this one, of course, luckily I didn't need to buy it this time, but so thank you for providing me with a copy. But also my library has already ordered copies for students, as I truly enjoyed it in reading, and both for clarity and the timely topics that it addressed. As I said, I will try to discuss about the book's topics from a public service perspective. So public sector organizations that, of course, from their standpoint, they are always at public value at their core. Comparison to corporations, public service organizations, of course, are there for a purpose. That is to serve society, to serve citizens in the needs that are deemed to be worth addressing by the society in the social contract. And of course, the most striking aspect that I experienced and I found in the book is this concept of public value conflicts. This, first of all, lives versus livelihood perspective. But if we want also to enlarge beyond life and livelihoods, but there are also other type of values like freedom, rather than also privacy. I think each of us, at least in Italy, at certain time we were asked to use apps in order to trace where we were going. And of course, that affected our privacy. There was a big debate about if that value was to be protected, or the life, the contrast to COVID-19 was preeminent rather than privacy. So I think public value conflicts that I found in the book is the core. And I think it's something we need to debate on how public values emerge and then are delivered into society. And I'd like to remember going back to the basics. So one of the major scholars on public values is Boseman. Boseman in his work underlined the fact that public values comes from a reflection in which we define what are the rights, the benefits to which citizens are entitled, which is, of course, are differentiated country by country, and that are dynamic changes over time. Second, that there is an obligation of citizen towards society, state, and others. On that reflection, it is important to underline that when we talk about public values, not just public service organizations that have to provide those public value, but there is also a matter of co-production, collaboration between the state, public service organization in general, and citizens. We need to protect public values also from the individual perspective. And trust. Trust is another keyword that also emerged during this pandemic. Trust is a glue that ties a society together, trust between citizens among them and between the citizen and the state. And of course, then the third point that Boseman underlined is related to the principles on which government and policies should be delivered and should then managed. The COVID-19 put all these aspects under pressure. And from reading the book, I think we can observe also in the chapter related to the post-truth public disvalue, which is a very important perspective of analysis, not just on how public value can be protected, produced, but also the way in which can be destroyed. So public value disvalue is very important. And during the COVID-19, I think we all observed how there's been a public value displacement, public value clash. Things that we thought to be granted, they needed to be protected, they needed to be displaced in order to guarantee the primacy to some other values. And also, we observed that the outcome of this public value clash or displacement had very different outcomes in different countries, different states, which again tells us on how public value is a key issue that needs to be started from an international comparison. That's why I've truly appreciated the last chapter of the book, comparing the case, the Indian case and the Pakistan case, and in studying from an international comparison perspective is very important when we are talking about public value. In that way, we can observe the differences in which way public value emerge in a country, the way it is created or it is not created, it destroyed, depending on the content. And I think what we are observing, that something that we need to be studied in future, is to see whether and how in different countries or in also a different level of analysis, because I think another perspective that Usman always had in his books is providing a multi-level analysis at the organizational point of view, national point of view, but also supranational point of view. And as far as Italy is concerned, that is very relevant because, as you know, Italy is part of the European Union, and being part of a supranational union affected the way COVID-19 was addressed, and what then the capability of intervention and protection of values, as we have seen in the European context. So this multi-level analysis is very important because we can appreciate the changes in public value and values at different levels at different times. And two last points before closing. I think, as I said, COVID-19 has represented an external shock that for some countries also affected the way in which they valued things. We need to remember that public values are not fixed, they change over time, and they mostly change after heavy shocks, external shocks, like war, pandemics, or other. So it will be important to observe the changes in values, what is valued. And so the changes in society, in the role of the state, and the role of the society at large. Also observing the risk of what is called in the literature the disembedded economy. That is when democracy and the public interest is trumped by economic concern. That is when the economics drives all the policy choices, and in that sense not protecting other values. Last but not least, from one research that I carried out during the COVID-19, what I have observed is also a process of hybridization of public values, in a sense that, particularly at the organizational level, public managers had to decide from one day to the other how to act. Just take, for example, what we did at the university. In 1 week, we reversed our teaching from in-presence 100% to online 100%. In 1 week, there was no choice. So we decided straight to protect that particular value, that is guarantee students with teaching. But then things started to change, and we felt that it was not only important to allow students to attend, but also to create value through distance learning. And then we started to hybridize this principle of guarantee education at a distance at any costs to other values, like guarantee the quality, guarantee also the effectiveness, and other values in delivering online teaching. This, of course, we resume in presence, but that experience in which values at the beginning were purified and then hybridized in this process. So to conclude, and going back to Hussain's book, as I said, very timely, insightful, and also after reading the other two books, coherent with the I would say series that he launched with his public value books. So that I invite everybody to to go through and to read, because public value will continue to be at the center of the policy level. But as we heard by Karl Moore, also from a corporate perspective, as with the economic, environmental issues globally, of course, public sector organization, but also corporation are key actors in delivering, creating, and then try to avoid the destruction of public value. So thanks, Usman, for this great effort in this book. Thank you for the invitation. I leave the word to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bracci, for sharing your views. I would now like to invite Professor Ana Santos Rutschman. Professor Rutschman has been assistant professor at St. Louis University and is now promoted to the rank of professor at Villanova University in the United States. She has published and presented widely on topics related to health law, food and drug regulation, intellectual property, innovation in life sciences, and law and technology. Her recent presentations have covered topics related to vaccines, other biotechnologies, healthcare, blockchain, e-health, and artificial intelligence in medicine. Her ongoing book, Vaccines as Technology, Innovation, Barriers, and Public Interest, is under contract with Cambridge University Press. She has sent a pre-recorded message for us today.
Hello, I'm Dr. Ana Rutschman, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, albeit virtually today. I am an assistant professor of law at St. Louis University Center for Health Law Studies and International and Comparative Law, and I'll be performing that role for the remainder of this week. And then next week, I become professor of law at Villanova University, also in the United States in the Philadelphia area. So if you're ever in the Philadelphia area, I welcome you there, and in particular, Dr. Chohan, the author of this wonderful book that we're celebrating today. We hope to host you at some point should you come to the United States. I'm positive you'd find audiences that are very interested in what you have to say and your very comprehensive work on this topic. So without further ado, I'm going to do my part for today, which is provide a very brief introduction to the book, and I prepared some slides. So I'm going to share my screen with you. So here we go. And obviously, you are by now, I hope, familiar with the book, which is incredibly timely, and it intersects with so many areas, scholarly and practical areas that have invested a lot of time and effort in understanding how we can deal better with the next pandemic, which we know is going to happen, unfortunately, and probably before not too long, as pandemics do, but also we can prepare better for public health crises, which, as Dr. Chohan points out throughout the book, are not merely public health crises. They also take a toll on multiple other areas. And that's one of the contributions, one of the many contributions of this book. These are just some of the highlights that I found throughout the book. As I mentioned in my brief introduction, I'm a law professor, and I work also with policy issues, mainly from a public health perspective. So these bullet points are not meant to encapsulate everything that the book does, which is a whole lot. I'm just highlighting a few things that resonated in particular with me, and that I suspect will resonate with people in the public health law and policy space. And even though I have never worked myself with public value theory, I could not not highlight the contribution of the book in this area, because it helps to populate the nascent field, and one that is providing very useful frameworks for us to understand where preparedness for upcoming health crisis might be experiencing some problems. So it's more than a theoretical approach that Dr. Chohan highlights comprehensively in the chapter on public value, but also throughout the book. I really think this is a tool to understand what has gone wrong and what can go better and prepare better for pandemics. It is something we desperately need to learn how to do. So one of the things I'm not going to linger on as I go through the other slides, but that I definitely must start that. There is how the book adds a very, very well-researched and coherently framed approach to public value theory, and lays out how it plays out in the field of pandemics and large-scale public health crises. We don't need a pandemic to resort to this theoretical framework. A large-scale public health crisis, an epidemic, a transnational outbreak of an infectious disease pose a lot of the same problems that pandemics do, as Dr. Chohan highlights throughout the book as well. The second thing that I would like to highlight, which I think is perfectly encapsulated in this expression, lives versus livelihoods, is something that probably is still very, very fresh in our collective and individual memories, because virtually every country on earth has experienced this dilemma. This divide, which I put the word apparent there, because I think one of the important contributions of the book is to explain how competing values sometimes can be reconciled, and sometimes there are ways to prioritize interventions when we have to cater to competing values. And again, public value theory is of help there. But I think lives versus livelihoods reminds each one of us here today of many of the dilemmas that we faced over the past 2.5 years. So public health is about preparedness and quick response and articulation of competing stakeholders, which might be all in the same country at the domestic level or spread across borders. But we have to come quickly and make decisions that will impinge on individual freedoms and on the economy, trade, and the like. And I have more to say on this in just a moment, but there is what appears often to be a divide that cannot be reconciled. And one of the contributions of the book is to first explain how these two seemingly separate areas actually overlap and have to work together during a pandemic, so that we don't bring the economy to a complete shutdown, but also as we curb disease, which again, we need to do and prepare to do in the future. The third thing I'd like to highlight is the role of transnational actors. The book has a case study on the World Health Organization. And I think one of the major contributions of this book is that it's one of the earliest in these early waves of scholarly contributions on a world that's now marked by misinformation and disinformation at a scale that we have not known before. Although misinformation and disinformation are not new phenomena, they are now via the internet and other digital tools being deployed in ways that we collectively are not familiar with historically, and these international or transnational actors now have to contend with that. And this is one of the first works in which I see that integrated into scholarly analysis. And then finally, the international / domestic conundrum. And by this, I mean that if we, for a moment, set aside some of the other things I've been discussing, which are international in nature, the response to disinformation about health, for instance, or about the pandemic, and this idea that the economy itself, it's not at this point realistic to be talking of just solely domestic economies. There's something to add to that in relationship at trade and economic level between countries. If we set that aside for a moment, there's still, and again, I'm a law professor, so my mind had to go there. There's still a problem of coordination between policies politics, even in laws at the international level versus the domestic level, with actors often not cooperating as public health principles or economic principles, for that matter, would like them to. And this is yet another area that the book contributes to. So what I'm going to do in the time that I have left is to go through the three main bullet points. I don't have much to add in terms of public value theory, in which Dr. Chohan is certainly an expert, but I will share with you some of the thoughts that came to mind on the lives versus livelihoods, the role of transnational actors and international / domestic conundrum areas of the book. And again, this does not fully encapsulate everything that the book touches on, but some of the things that stood out to me, and I think to people with my background or working in these fields. On the topic of lives versus livelihoods, there's something that public value theory focuses on that resonates both in public health, but in other areas of law and policy. And this is the idea that we have competing values. We have objectives that in themselves are worth pursuing. We want a vibrant economy at the domestic level and at that transnational level, and we want healthy populations. So these are competing goals, and they're both good goals. So what happens when the worlds collide? And I'm using economy here to encapsulate the livelihood portion, as Dr. Chohan calls it, of this debate. So we want to prevent disease, the onset of disease, and we want to respond as efficiently as we can to the outbreak of disease. That's the lives part of the equation. And then we have what I call the economy or livelihoods in Dr. Chohan's words, but also think about trade, think about labor and other areas that are impacted by the imposition of the most stringent kind of public health measures, from complete shutdowns, which we experienced here in the United States, to restrictions on labor laws and what you can do in your workplace, or to commerce, right? For which businesses get to be open and for how long, how many restrictions we're going to place in terms of capacity and the like. So these are all things that under normal circumstances are legal to regulate, are desirable from a practical perspective, but they're clashing at this point, the imposition of public health measures and the economy. And I think one of the important points that the book does that I often don't see in scholarship, and some types of scholarship, I should say, is not only the characterization of the lives and the livelihoods portion of this puzzle, but also the idea that this is not really a divide, right? We tend to think of this as one or the other, or how much of one, how much of the other. But really, this is a false dichotomy, and the book makes a very important contribution there, because really these are interconnected areas of law, of policy, of politics, and of life in general, of living in a society collectively. So I think that's an extremely important contribution that the book makes, and I'm going to just add something on the law side of things, since that's my background, because I think the book underscores something that, if nothing else, law offers a proof of, and that's the idea that the laws and policies that we have historically passed to encourage things like biomedical innovation, so the laws that serve as incentives for companies and individuals to create new diagnostics, personal protective equipment, vaccines, and treatments, which broadly fall under the umbrella of intellectual property and patent law that reward innovation. These laws that are set at the international level and are adopted by virtually every country in the world, they're intellectual property laws. They regulate health goods. But when we pass things like the TRIPS agreement or the Doha Declaration on Public Health, which attaches to the TRIPS agreement, the intellectual property framework we all use, we attach that to trade laws. So the laws that were designed to incentivize the production of health goods, any type of health goods, from medicines to medical devices, if there's any problem regarding infringement of intellectual property, those are litigated through trade channels. The international IP agreement that you see highlighted here, the IP agreement that we call TRIPS, it's actually part of the World Trade Organization system, and it's administered by trade-related international organizations. So this is something that came to mind as I went through the book and the portion of the book in which Dr. Chohan dissected the different areas of lives and livelihoods that are affected by pandemics and large-scale epidemics. And I just wanted to offer this supporting idea that we know in international policymaking, if nothing else, that the two things are related, that a healthy world is actually not incompatible with more than that, has to be compatible with measures that are designed to keep our economies strong. And I think that moving forward, this suggests that we still need public health responses, and hopefully not just responses to public health crises, but also preparedness. So things we do to lessen the impact of future pandemics and epidemics, we have to prepare for those. They're going to come, they're going to be needed, but they have to be tailored, right? We want the least possible stringent form of public health intervention. And as long as we keep that need for tailoring in mind, I think we just have to go about our future lives thinking that these interventions are critical, not just to public health, but also to the economy, to trade, and to labor-related goals, because the COVID-19 pandemic certainly posed a toll on all of these areas, which I'm calling economy here in the bottom, trade and labor, and Dr. Chohan called livelihoods. My second to last thought is on the role of transnational actors, and I'm going to be brief here for the sole reason that the case study on the World Health Organization that the book focuses on, I'm not going to comment on it. I'm currently a consultant to the World Health Organization. And this does not mean that I don't think that the organization itself has a whole lot to learn. I think it does. I think it has many things it can improve on, but I don't want to comment on it due to a current conflict of interests, but I highly recommend that you go through this case study. And I want to suggest that some of the findings in this portion of the book are actually applicable to other transnational actors. In fact, some of them slightly different in structure. So in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw CEPI and CTAP. CEPI is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and CTAP is also a platform that brings together public-private actors, at the international level. So we had multiple types of international actors. Dr. Chohan focuses on an international organization, one that has a long history. And I want to suggest that a lot of these findings also are applicable to more recent transnational actors, and some of them that don't really take the form of a WHO or similar, but they might just be an international public-private partnership, as the two that I have highlighted here. And I also think that the findings of this case study are applicable to organizations operating in the public health space, even if there's no pandemic or epidemic. So CARB-X focuses on the production and allocation of medicines and other health goods needed to combat antimicrobial resistance. That's what the acronym stands for. And Gavi is a Geneva-based, like WHO, a Geneva-based vaccine, childhood vaccine procurement organization. So again, they're not exactly structured in the same way that an organization like the World Health Organization is, but they share many of the virtues and the coordinating virtues at the international level, and many of the faults of the World Health Organization, because some of them are more gargantuan than others. They take some time to respond to the need that they need to face, simply because there's some degree of coordination that needs to be achieved. They need a certain degree of funding that's not necessarily always easy to guarantee. They're not exempt from politics, from the political economy, from controversy. We saw the US threatening to leave the World Health Organization during the pandemic. So I just want to suggest that what we read about in this case study is applicable elsewhere, and I would direct people at these organizations to read the book, and I'll be promoting this book widely also at that level. And I also want to say, as I did in the introduction, that these transnational organizations are are contending with a new phenomenon. And one of the things we know from the literature is that they're having some difficulty in responding to misinformation and disinformation. That's something that Dr. Chohan talks about quite a bit in the book, and it's again one of the first scholarly accounts of that phenomenon, because it's much easier and faster to promote health-related mis and disinformation than it is to verify data, produce credible accounts, and disseminate it. So this is an emerging challenge that these organizations, not just the World Health Organization, have to contend with in the near future. And as the book also mentions, there's an accountability and transparency deficit at many of these organizations. It's not exclusive to the realm of public health, but it's something that the book draws attention to. And I think that's an important debate for, again, the World Health Organization and beyond. And then finally, I'll end with the international/domestic conundrum. A lot of the problems we see have to do with the fact that public health disease in general knows no physical or sovereign borders, and yet laws and policies really do operate across lines that were artificially drawn, sometimes with good reasons, sometimes perhaps not, but that's how they tend to operate. And this gives rise to the phenomenon of vaccine nationalism, which Chapter 5 focuses on. So the idea that countries are buying vaccines, and for that matter, other health goods, as any type of widget, any type of gadget, right? They're not buying them as health products per se, they're negotiating them as commodities. And Economics 101 dictates that the countries with the greatest purchasing power and perhaps know-how in terms of repeat connections with the suppliers of these goods will always win vis-a-vis the countries that might have a greater public health need, but don't have the same type of resources. And this ties to the phenomenon that Professor Halaby here in the US calls viral sovereignty. So this idea that, again, some of the things we might need to produce these vaccines and health goods might be available in a country, right? And some countries have tried to assert sovereignty, again, saying, because this was found within my territory, I'm going to withhold these samples that might be needed to understand the disease or to produce a pharmaceutical product. So this is the other conundrum we're facing, and I personally have been working a lot in this area. And moving forward, we really need a way to negotiate the fair allocation of health goods. We've experienced that with vaccines in this pandemic and the previous pandemic, as Dr. Chohan describes in the book. And I dearly hope that we take to heart the things, the phenomena, the problems that Dr. Chohan surveys in the book. The account certainly offers a lot of food for thought, and I think this is a very important first step in getting a whole lot of different players, from mere law professors like me to people at these international organizations to society at large, to thinking about what we can do better the next time around. And we cannot do better if we don't understand what's happening on the ground during the pandemic and the epidemic. So thank you, Dr. Chohan, for writing this book. It was a pleasure to read it, and I hope to meet you in person at some point. But in the meantime, I will remain a fan of your work.
Thank you, Professor Rutschman. I would now like to invite Dr. Usman Chohan. Dr. Usman Chohan is an international economist and an academic who serves as Director of Economic Affairs and National Development at CAS. He's among the top 10 business authors on Social Science Research Network, which is the largest open repository of knowledge in the world. He has published 4 books in 4 years, and in the academic realm, his research has been cited widely. Pandemics and Public Value was Dr. Usman's 4th book at CAS, and his forthcoming fifth book is titled Activist Retail Investors and the Future of Financial Markets. I would now like to invite the author of the book so he can give us a deeper insight.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Enrico, Karl, and Ana, for taking the time to participate in this event virtually. I'm very grateful that I was able to find the best people to join me for this. The title of the book is Pandemics and Public Value Management. So you have for pandemics, Ana Rutschman. You have for management, Karl Moore. And for public value, you have Enrico Bracci. So you really get the best, and they read this book. I knew that these are three people who actually read it, and they did. And they all came across with different lessons from reading the same text. So that's part of the magic. Now I'll give you my narrative of what I wrote. So, background, chapter discussions, and then some conclusions. Straightforward. It's my fourth book. It's my best one. I swear to God. Because I don't think I'll be able to write something as passionately, having been a part of it, as we all were. Pandemic is a very specific time. 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, you'll be telling younger people, oh, you don't know what it was like in 2020. And you'll exaggerate with stories. It's unique. 65,000 words. And the logic behind it was that as the pandemic unfolded, the early days, I noticed that public value scholars were writing as if, what do I mean? Nothing has happened, no pandemic. I said, really, no pandemic at all? Why isn't work being done on this? Because if you ask me, there's a million things one can write about that are public value informing the pandemic and the pandemic informing public value, reciprocally, as academia should be. So I said, well, I'll just pick the 6 best ideas and work with them. But there's no shortage of this stuff. That was the logic behind it. The work ended up being somewhere between science and the social science, and from the esteemed panel that we have today, you'll see that there is a law professor, there's a management professor, and there's an accounting professor, and they all enrich the discussion through their perspectives on the work. Essentially, there's an intro and a conclusion, naturally, but there are 5 themes that I picked within it. The first one, which you saw from the presentation, is value conflict. Everybody expresses and holds values, and societies as a whole then in aggregation reflect them. But there's a conflict. For example, when the pandemic has come, there is a value that I have a right to my freedom, so I won't follow these lockdowns. That's my right. I value freedom. But the other one is restraint. That if I do this, somebody else's life could be saved because I won't use different values. The big one is lives versus livelihood. So the logic behind it, I'll go in the subsequent thing, is either you prioritize health or you prioritize the economy. Why? Because if you keep the economy open, you could damage the health. If you work only on health, you lock everything down, the economy goes to hell. That's this. It's not easy to balance that, but there's nuance to it. The chapter 3 was post-truth era. So what is really the science behind COVID was an issue that was a kind of piñata. People would hit it about misinformation. I picked the case study of Brazil. There were 3, electoral autocracies that you could pick from. You could pick Trump, you could pick Modi, you could pick Bolsonaro. The United States, I've done a lot of public value work already. It's kind of boring. India, I saved for the comparison, the comparative one. So then I worked on Bolsonaro and Bolsonarism as an idea. And then chapter 4 is a case study of the WHO, because you would have thought that, like in previous epidemics or pandemics, there is a United Nations affiliate or branch that would lead the charge, like they eradicated smallpox, yellow fever, West Nile virus, so many things. The WHO was the star. This time, Trump says, I'm going to leave this institution. I don't care about them, they're liars. So where is that leadership in the world? That's why you have to study what is the value that they create, and what do they articulate the values of which public, the world public? Well, that's the trickiness that I dealt with. It is a kind of boring chapter, but it is worthwhile, as you saw from Ana's discussion, that it does speak to other agencies. That was her interpretation. Vaccine nationalism, I grew heavily on. My thinking was informed heavily by Professor Rutschman, because she has done a lot of work on vaccine nationalism, and it became a very irritating thing at the time that I was coming to the midway of the book. You can prioritize your own public because you produce vaccines. Let's say you're a developed country that can do it. But there is an excess nationalism, and you don't give the vaccines out at all, right? And there's a reason, for example, that Omicron emerged somewhere that vaccines were not taken on. So there's a reason for that. It isn't coincidental. Nationalism is the idea. So which public are we trying to protect? We as a world are one public, but then this mohalla is a public. That's the problem, international and national, which Enrico kindly observed to be the multi-layered analysis. And finally, comparative PEV. For us in the audience here today, I think this has been the most interesting one. Agar aap padhne isko. India's COVID journey is worlds apart from ours. There are reasons for that. And I want to bear testament to that, so that when people read this in the future, they see that we are not so different from them genetically, economically, but in our world, we're living two different dimensions in terms of COVID. Why? Public value is what I use to find the answers to that. So that is the most important chapter in my judgment. Okay. So we start with the premise that fortunately there's no vaccine for stupidity. I saw a lot of stupidity, and so public value can help to deal with this idea. This is particularly true for chapter 3 and the post-truth. Okay. If you prioritize lives, it means you close everything down. If you prioritize livelihood, you maintain a normalcy in the economy, and it's one or the other. Some politicians particularly like to frame it, not here, but abroad. Then you look to the arguments that if you have lives, well, humans first. There's no economy outside of human experience, so you have to prioritize humans. It's a lives argument. Losses, if people die, that is a greater economic loss, an actuarial loss. And its bidirectionality isn't there. So if you veer towards public health, you won't be able to go back to the economy that people will be dead. It only goes one way. Once you prioritize the economy, then the economy is that people have died. That's it. And as some people, including myself, say, there's no practical or ethical sense in this trade-off, right? On the livelihoods thing, there are valid concerns too. That's why it becomes a philosophical chapter. Some citizens may articulate a genuine, legitimate need for openness. For example, if you're a bikea rider or somebody who needs to be mobile to deliver, to earn a basic living, okay, your grandmother is safe, but you are going hungry, right? I mean, some people have a genuine need to do their work no matter what. There is a greater damage, is an argument, from just locking down an entire city. Shanghai is a recent example. 20 million people, you lock every person down? There's such thing as going too far. And you know what? Desperation and hunger can kill 100% of people. COVID's fatality rate is 2%. Hunger will kill 100%. So this is what I tried to balance in it. And in addition to the lives and livelihoods, as the chapter does, there's other conflicts. Your sense of duty to others, but your sense of freedom. Economically restrained, so you have to save for the future, or relief. When people are suffering, you have to spend heavily. And many countries spend heavily. Some governments spend heavily and stupidly. Some spend moderately and prudently. Like this one, there's a limited stimulus package, but it went to be very poor. Oversight and privacy. So some countries have these sort of cameras or apps watching over you, and then there's a right to privacy. I don't want the government to know where I am. Empathy and self-preservation. Epistemic truth and relativism. That was so important it became chapter 3 itself. Efficiency versus equity. So the most efficient solution is often not the most equal one or iniquitous, right? But if you focus a lot on equity, it often is an inefficient solution. So finding ways to deal with COVID requires trade-offs that are tricky. So that's why this chapter is valuable. I'm grateful that all the previous speakers referred to it, because it matters a lot as a chapter. It's also quite a long one. Okay. Post-truth era, on this graph, the United States is green, Brazil is blue, India is yellow, Pakistan is a dark green. Brazil stands up. Why? This guy, his government, but it isn't so easy to just point the finger at one person and say he is a bad guy. There are systems of conflict within all countries, including in Brazil, between those who were on his side, which is to say, this is all nonsense, let's have a good time. Gripezinha. Gripezinha means the chota sa bufar, halka sa bufar. It's no big deal. Gripezinha. And there were people in the same sorts of functions in society which fought against it. For example, Bolsonaro's government, this is where I posit a new idea in public value, which is there's a strategic triangle, then you have a triangle of disvalue. How did the destruction happen? Which talks about the conflict. So he had what's called the office of hatred. That abused everybody who's not on your side, but oppositional politicians fought back, particularly at the state level, not just at the federal level. In Brazil, the executive machinery was working for Bolsonaro's ideas. It doesn't matter. But the judiciary, the courts, played a very big part in saying this is nonsense. The Sao Paulo court will say, no, we will have the lockdown. This tension is a very important lesson for how government or public values agents fight. At civil society level, there were some mega pastor churches and populists who were totally on board with him. They give him a lot of votes. There's a big following in the evangelical community, for example. But there were healthcare advocacy groups and media people who were saying what is happening is wrong. So it's a very interesting case. There are two parallel societies. Polarization is a big worry for all societies, including ours. This was a perfect example of the disvalue created by it. Chapter 4, WHO. Hello, WHO. We know who we are. WHO, the WHO. What is its value? I already said why I picked it. So it produces global public goods. It manages, and this is the most important one, cross-border externalities. COVID can hop boundaries without a visa. So that's where it starts to mean that a global leader has to do something about this, or people have to work in unison under an expert leadership, but it couldn't do its maximum. Mobilizing global solidarity and offering global health stewardship. I ended up reading about 100,000 words on the WHO to write this chapter. And so it ends up being a dull chapter, but you can highlight the challenges of the WHO. There is Ghebreyesus, the Ethiopian head of the WHO, and he's in a straitjacket because he was hamstrung in terms of what he could do. The first thing is the incentivization problem. So countries have different incentives to deal with the WHO. Poor countries have generally used the WHO since its inception to articulate their needs. It ended up being a very pro-poor organization, so rich countries then push back against it. The imbalances between member states. If Trump said, I'll just cut off the funding, well, what happens to their budget? Private power is a very interesting idea because a lot of work is being done, which is very interesting, by, for example, the Bill Gates Foundation on malaria, on WHO. But you see, in terms of post-truth, Bill Gates is treated like Satan on social media. So private power, is it good? Is it bad? Whose values? Who does Bill Gates, who has elected Bill Gates to do this stuff? Nobody. So these issues are treated in quite detail in it. Relations with other multilaterals is very interesting because, as I said, if the poor countries are using WHO, the rich countries will use the World Bank. And the World Bank introduced different healthcare approaches that are actually contradictory. So but the point being that in this arena where one expert authority could be, there's 10 authorities. That's it. Historically, and in COVID, it became much worse. So I do the strategic triangle analysis to arrive what is in the second column. They have a partial legitimacy, partial recognition of value, and partial operational resources. And that's why it made a partial positive contribution. Chapter 5, very quickly, there is a limit to right national priorities. We're elected by your people to make decisions for them, but there is bigger issues of solidarity and the nature of the scientific process by which viruses transmit across boundaries that makes it all a kind of silly idea. So I do discuss, there is legitimate vaccine nationalism, but then there's a boundary beyond that. Public value is very useful for that. And finally, this one I can go into a bit more detail because it is interesting. These are two countries, and They are both young. That's row 4. They have young people. We have young people. And old people only 5%. We have elderly 4%. Our obesity rate is 8-ish%. Theirs is 4 because they're vegetarian. Even better than us. So actually, they look kind of good and not so different. Immunization for BCG, we have 86%. They have 92%. We are 37% urban. 30. They're not so different on paper. So what happened that we are so different in COVID from them? How did that happen? We have 9 doctors per people, with 8 doctors per 10,000 people. Yet the graph shows a different story. I mean, it's catastrophic. One is cases and one is deaths. A repeat graph. To remind you, we should actually do Pakistan first. Imran Khan at the time said, we can't block everything down. It's not possible. People will starve. It doesn't make sense. There was no politician who made any anti-COVID speech in this country, to my knowledge, none. Even in civil society, people believed personally, there were no mass strikes like in other countries. Civil society did not do it. And the public managers were efficiently centralized in the NCOC, which took civil, military experts, the provincial, the federal authorities. Everybody is coordinated and centralized response, which is the ideal format to deal with disasters. And where a poor country would struggle with governmental resources, civil society has to step in, and here, hamdardi badi thi, garibon ki fark. Amongst society coming towards mutual aid. There was a lot done in COVID. It's quite remarkable. Civil society, this is a big lesson for public value. Civil society can play a bigger role in developing countries than developed countries. And so you look at the multi-actor triangle and you have all the elements. Whatever tools we had, we used to the best. The state bank stimulus program was targeted using the Benazir Income Support Program, etc. It was a small percentage of her GDP, and it was a small absolute amount, but it went to the people who deserved it most. Similarly, you have a rural support program, which is kind of a polio architecture realigned towards COVID. So whatever you had, you used best. You can do remarkable things if you are all on the same page of preserving public value. What happened in a neighboring country? At a 4 hours notice, their prime minister says, every street, every village, har gali, har ye wo main band kar dunga for 3 weeks. So if you are told that 9 p.m., you won't be able to go anywhere for the next 3 weeks, there's hell to pay. So people fled the cities, knowing that the civil society mutual aid wasn't there. They have a caste problem. Why should I take care of lower caste people? This psychology exists. Why should I take care of this Muslim? This attitude was very damaging because they don't act as a singular public that has to work together. The politicians were very denialist about it. The fund that they created for it, the PM Cares Fund, has charges of embezzlement, corruption, it's all a nonsense. And the center didn't act in a unified fashion. Instead, each state had to do it. So when states do it, some will do well, some will do poorly. Kerala, for example, did fine, but Maharashtra was Andhra Pradesh. I mean, it's all a mixed bag. And so when I have to use a rubric of values to assess what was done right and what was done wrong, we will give 5 out of 5 to Pakistan, but 0 out of 5 to India. So let history bear witness that when you want to work together in a concerted manner, this is what is possible. And that is the chapter 6. I encourage you, if you get the time, to at least read that one. And that's what this book entails. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Usman. The floor is open for question and answer session. I will take 3 questions at a time, and please introduce yourself first. Okay. Any more questions? Are there more questions in the audience? If you could introduce yourself and please be a bit louder.
Enrico and Carl, could you hear me?
Yes, I can hear when you are speaking from that mic.
Yes.
I cannot hear the rest of the audience.
Yes, so I will just repeat the summary of the 3 questions.
Thanks.
Thank you.
If you would like to answer them. The first relates to, has capitalism's nature changed in a major way since the pandemic erupted? Do you feel? The second question was, do you think that hardcore lockdowns, as we just witnessed in, for example, Shanghai in April, such tough measures at this stage, do they show any lesson drawing, or is it just sort of autopilot? The third one was about religion. So what sort of role do you think religion has played in public values during the pandemic? Would like to take that.
Well, I will leave to Karl Moore maybe the first one about capitalism. I may try to chip in the last two. So the second one relates to one of the major heavy measures against COVID-19, heavy lockdown, and I experienced heavy lockdown in the first month of the pandemic, where we, well, maybe less heavy than China, the Chinese one, but still heavy. And I think that we learn that maybe that one cannot be the solution. As I said, if we want to maintain public values, that means avoiding what happened during the COVID, the heavy lockdown, that is also differentiating the burden of heavy lockdown across society. I think we need to learn on how to manage future pandemics with some restrictions, with some responsibility at the individual level. But from my experience and also the debate that is going on has shown that heavy lockdown without a collaboration between institutions and individuals, heavy lockdown is not the solution. As the third one, I think religion, of course, religions affects societies in terms of values. And of course, Italy has a Catholic tradition, which I would say considers affected the way in which we reacted to COVID-19 and the way we try to care for the others as well, particularly elderly people. Of course, I don't have experience in other countries, but I can say that, of course, religion has a role as it brings values across a society. I leave to Mark for the first question about capitalism. I have my view, but he's more on corporate strategy, and so it may give a better insights.
Well, I'll comment and now. Appreciate Enrico's comments. It seems like capitalism is in the midst of changing before the pandemic, but I think the pandemic accelerated it as there was more of a sense of what's happening to the world, a bit of a sense of community, that you're part of a neighborhood, you're part of a community, a global community, but a very local community. On the other hand, is people could only talk to their neighbors. So we started a thing where we'd have a beverage on Friday night in front of the house by the park, David's house and Marion's house. And we get there safely distanced on our lawn chairs, having a drink and chatting about life. And there was a closeness to the community that had been lacking there. So I think there's that was accelerated by it. We also have working from home. So that's changing. How do we enculturate people? How do we make them part of an organization? And people are more apt to leave more rapidly. That's partly Generation Z and younger millennials, but it's also the nature of work has evolved during COVID-19, and we think about work a bit differently and where we work from. And going down to tall buildings in the city center is something which is occurring, but less than it did in the past. So there's a very interesting evolution to capitalism in terms of connection to an organization and how much time you actually spend there. And I would echo some of Enrico's comments about religion, is that in Canada it's atheistic and Christian, and the Christian part would argue for caring for your neighbor. One of the central ideas of Judaism, of Islam as well, is caring and loving your neighbor. On the other hand, we saw in some of the right-wing Christian churches in the U.S., fired up by Trumpism, ignoring, and a few churches just meeting together against the law, and some pastors being arrested. So there's kind of some extremists on the right-hand side. But the central view of religion and its better moments would be to caring for your neighbor, and during the COVID-19, care for the elderly neighbor. Make sure the widow is got some food, and things like that. And we saw that occurring in our neighborhood at a very micro level. So I would echo some of the thoughts that our colleague in Italy had. Back to you.
Thank you. Echoing what Professor Moore and Professor Bracci said, religion has had a positive and negative impact depending on where you are. Here, civil society has the Judeo-Christian Islamic values of mutual aid. But at the same time, the case study of Brazil shows that the mega pastors there were part of the problem. So I echo that. As far as capitalism, sir, I will save this question for my next book, which is the title Future of Financial Markets. But what Professor Moore said is essentially true. My focus in that is about the retail investor. So capitalism has a much more digital element now, and it has a bit of a whimsical element, the meme stocks and people going wild and trying to sabotage the markets, but still situated in the logic of capitalism. They just want a quick cut out of it and are tired of Wall Street. And the antagonism towards Wall Street has gotten much worse because, at least in the United States, a lot of the funding went into the corporations and not directly to the very poor, as it did here, for example. We'll take two more questions. Thanks. Yes, so as a follow-up question to the China one, there is a point where, so public value perspective is, if the public values this, then you should execute it. So now it's not so much the science, but the ideology behind it, because the cases and fatalities of COVID have been so low in China, it has become a point of pride and a marker that we are just that much better than the United States. And if it's something the public values, then you're addressing it, and so you say hard lockdowns, restraint, and you score points with the public because you just have to make this point. But if the people don't really believe that, then you're doing something against their values. That's the public value perspective. But ideology and science, again, chapter 3, they don't necessarily go hand in hand from a public value perspective. Take two more questions. Oh, sir, go ahead. To summarize the question, to what extent do you feel traditions and social relations as they have existed impacted outcomes in the pandemic, as in close friendships, families, inequalities among the public? Do you feel that these sorts of long-standing issues were big in determining how countries succeeded in the pandemic? I can offer my answer, and that is that naturally the case study shows that the social relations, civil society has a huge part in this. It can fill the gap where the state may not be able to do so. And if you're a disciplined society, it means that when the state says this is how it is, then you can actually conform to that. Otherwise, you're the one resisting that, which means that if these are your values, to conform to those values, the government has to then do that instead, which may not be based on a scientific reasoning. And that can be very damaging. So if the public wants this, if you want to adhere to that, you better do that, but that may not be the best because the public doesn't decide in its favor what it wants based on the science. That's where social relations and traditions can make a big difference. In the interest of time, I don't think we should take more questions. We're running a little bit over time. I'll hand it over to the moderator.
Thank you, sir. I would now like to invite President Cass to deliver his closing remarks.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ladies and gentlemen, I always have a problem at the end of every seminar. Since I'm always the last speaker, I'm always here to repeat things. So I try and this time bear with me some permutations that I wanted to do. I like to avoid as much as I can cut down on my written speech, but there's few essentials that are to be understood that Dr. Usman pointed out. First of all, let me thank ladies and gentlemen for sparing your valuable time for today's event, for launching a very important book by Dr. Usman, Pandemics and Public Value Management. My special thanks to Professor Ana from USA, from St. Louis University, Professor Bracci, University of Ferrara, Italy, and Professor Karl Moore from McGill University, Canada, for being with us to offer their valuable views on the book authored by our colleague and a public value theorist, Dr. Usman Chohan, who's our Director Economic Affairs at CAS. This is his fourth book, and he said this speech, the best one. I like to differ with him. Best one so far. You have the ability to do much more and much better performance. The pandemic under discussion, the COVID-19, struck the world hastily and mercilessly. In the wake, it left hardships and misery for the world at a level unseen, at least in our lifetime. In response to its swiftness and severity, societies came close to themselves going off, shutting down completely, thus creating economic disruption and aftershocks for the entire world. The pandemic has actually shaken the entire health, economic, and logistic systems of the globe. While it seems receding, its effects still continue, some of which are also visible on the streets of Pakistan in the form of economic turmoil. Economic fragility, underfunded public sector providers, political figures, and social inequality all made themselves evident as societies were put under immense duress. There were intense manifestations of challenges to the values held by the public, as well as questions raised on what each public truly values. The book, as Dr. Usman mentioned, has 7 chapters, and I just touched on some important aspects of chapter 2 and chapter 6 that relates to Pakistan. Chapter 2 talks of lives and livelihoods. It is probably not a competition, but a prioritization between the two by various tools of the society. And there are 3 tools that he's talked about. I'm sorry if I'm using the wrong terminology. The political leadership, they shape the direction. Societies absorb it and react to the direction. So these are the important elements. And then the people or the two, that is to do, that is the bureaucrats, deputy commissioners, mayors, and all that, those who implement the instructions. So it's not only the leadership. Yes, that makes the difference, but the people below who do it matter a lot. And that is what I will talk of India-Pakistan comparison to some extent, or have we fared out well. But first, the comparison of the 2 pandemics, 1918 to 20, the flu and COVID-19. In this chapter mentions about the 43 countries data. 39 million people died in 1918 to 22 years. That's 2% of the population of that time in the world. That is huge. However, if the same ratio was to go, the COVID-19 also has more or less the same time frame, but the if same ratio was to continue or to follow, the deaths should have been about 150 million. Imagine if there were 150 million deaths. So the 2 flus, what he wants to mention, both have been handled probably differently, both in terms of livelihood and lives. So there is no data as yet completed on COVID, but on the previous pandemic, 6 to 8% of the GDP was lost on the average world, which is also not too small a figure. COVID-19, many countries have gone to that. Some have even gone below. So this also talks of The countries that successfully, Dr. Usman says, successfully played a balance between lives and livelihood have done better than the others. For my own reasons, I would like to retouch the India-Pakistan comparison. The reason is, I feel that had these figures been made available at that time to our society through the media, because our media is used to picking up the negative effects, the negative impacts, negative part of an event to make a breaking news. The positivity was left out. There are a lot of positives in Pakistan handling this problem. Had we known this as a society, we may have done even better than this. We only knew the negative side of it, mostly. A multi-actor triangle approach to Pakistan's coronavirus effects, as per Dr. Usman's research, comparing the two, India and Pakistan. First, the political leadership. In case of Pakistan, he mentioned it, sober appraisal, coordinated strategy. In case of India, it was a brutal lockdown. Corruption and so many other things that he mentioned. If you look at these two, we stand out far better in our reaction to this as the Dr. Research is concerned. It's all based on research, not opinion alone. The second was the civil society. Of course, there was a question also asked. Two questions of this. The charitable disposition and efforts to mutual aid, rural support programs, these played major role in our reduced deaths and keeping the balance. If you recall, in our society also, probably leadership played a major role, because when we saw in the beginning, like the whole world, our people are also at different tiers of political level, going against the government, go for a lockdown. When everybody else is going for a lockdown, why don't you go for a lockdown? Taking this pressure was a big plus factor from the society. And I think the leadership needs a commendable appreciation on that. The third was the public managers. Whatever the reasons, in Pakistan, it was centralized coordination of civil military manpower mobilized. It was center point and it was effective. The enforcement decisions of the center of operations were effective. While at that time, we were always hearing from the media that, we're not doing this, we're not doing this, we're not doing this. But actually, it was a balance being played. How much to lose where, or how much to gain where. That was the balance being played by our managers, our society. So, and in India, as one mentions, it is inaptitude of it. And total mismanagement and lack of coordination. If you recall, I just to explain the same point that Dr. Chohan mentioned. One day, Mr. Modi decides to declare a lockdown of everything in Delhi. Now, Delhi is a big city. People come across from long distances to earn their daily living. And people had to walk hundreds of miles to go to safer places, to go to their homes. And of course, people lost their lives in between, got injuries. They had to stay in jungles. It's a terrible thing to see that. So that's the difference. So what happened? That's the result that in the 5 other elements that you mentioned, where we achieved 5 out of 5 rating in case of Pakistan, and 0 versus out of 5 in India. it's not a small achievement. I think as society, our managers, our leadership deserves that credit for this achievement. There are various factors I'd not like to repeat those. I just move on to some of the conclusions that I have made, of course, out of the book that I had to read before I go on. Decision making in our society must reflect the values of the people and should intend to serve the people. During the pandemic, preserving lives and livelihood, public health and economy were equally important. The countries that succeeded in the pandemic, like I said earlier, were the ones that upheld a commitment to war. COVID-19 was a test of all countries, and Pakistan's remarkable performance during this difficult period, despite meager resources, shows that we were capable of confronting even great challenges. Shows that protecting the people was as important as their livelihood. International institutions are now struggling to find their place in changing world order, also touched by Dr. Usman. This is a very important point. The international leaders, means the WHO, was not given its due lead. The nation's national leadership prioritized their priorities of how to handle it. That probably also resulted in what Dr. Usman said, the vaccine nationalism, because the leaders thought of their national interest, not of the humanity. If it was World Health Organization handling these subjects, the result may have been better in case of pandemic. It is not just the COVID pandemic that has been difficult for the world economy, but the post-COVID problems, including supply issues and global inflation, are equally worrying at this stage. Uneven recoveries around the world are putting developing countries at extreme economic risk, as we at home also. The effects will last for a little while. It's not over as yet. Health is a basic human right, which is why the market-based approaches tend to cause problems. So I have the money, I can buy a vaccine. The others have no money, they have no right. The disparity was so much, certain countries had gone to the booster stage where the countries did not even have the first dose. They did not have the money. This disparity, as Dr. Saab terms it, the vaccine nationalism, took a lot of things in poor countries, underdeveloped countries. COVID-19 possibly is not going to be the last pandemic mankind has seen. Therefore, there was a need to put in place a well-functioning international system that can help make us more resilient during future crises. The world needs to be ready for such pandemics, including, of course, Pakistan. Ladies and gentlemen, at the end, once again, let me thank you on behalf of CAS for of course, our honorable speakers for their views, and for the guests to spare time, and the CAS team for making this arrangement. And I thank you all.
Thank you, sir. This brings us to the conclusion of the ceremony. Lastly, it remains for me to pay my sincere gratitude to the distinguished speakers and the esteemed audience for joining us today at this book launch event. and making it a success. I now request you all to proceed for tea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrico, Karl, for sparing your time. We're all headed off to tea right now. If I could, I would offer you a virtual tea myself.
But we have tea here in Canada
Yeah.
as well.
In Italy too, although it's very
So
hot
please have a
nowadays.
nice tea and think of me.
Thank you, Usman, for invitation.
Yeah, thanks very much. Enjoyable conversation.
Thank you. Take care.
See you again.
Take care.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.